Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to open our virtual event on EU-Israel relations during the Czech Presidency of the European Union. I will very quickly give the first to the greetings to the two greeters the admission to speak, and then we will right away move to the first panel, and I will introduce the aim of the conference. So Dr. Andrei Dietrich, the director of the Institute for International Relations in Prague, please begin.
Thank you very much, Maya, and good afternoon to everyone here in the Zoom room, but also everyone who is watching us on the Facebook and other platforms. Let me just very quickly say that I'm very glad myself and on behalf of the Institute of International Relations Prague that we are doing this event together with WIM, and I hope it's one or the first of many other events to follow, including some hopefully in person. We are always keen to develop bilateral relations with research institutions, think tanks in Israel. But I believe there's a broader context here also, when the importance of these partnerships is even more important due to the turbulences in global politics that we are witnessing. I mean, we are faced with a much deteriorated security environment due to the imperialist logic of Russia, foreign policy, with China not always keen on playing by the rules, and the global order as a consequence of this is contested, and the ordering mechanisms that have kept this order running for a very long time, for decades, are weakened, and alternatives are being pushed forward, which are contrary to our values and our interests. And this weakening of the order at a global scale, of course, is projected also to more regional instability in Europe, and this will be a subject of our discussions today, where the Helsinki architecture, security architecture, now lays in ruins. In Asia Pacific, perhaps the center of gravity of the superpower competition to come, but also Africa and, of course, the Middle East. So, as European Union and as member states, we are facing increasingly challenging and hostile neighborhood, and this makes the value and importance of our alliances even greater than before. And what I mean here is broad and intersectional alliances of not just states but societies who buy into kind of this basic pillars of multilateral order that is based on sovereign equality and respect to the basic norms of international society. And building these relations is actually one of the pillars of our mission as the Institute of International Relations, because what we do is basic research of various issues of global politics, policy research for the policymakers, but also building this outreach of international networks, and contributing thus to shared understanding of the key challenges that we face today, including now, this very moment ahead of the forthcoming EU-Israel Association Council, to which the Czech Presidency, representing a country that historically has had excellent relations with Israel and which believes in the value of a very close relationship between the EU and Israel, invests quite a lot. We have a great lineup of speakers, participants to discuss the important issues of the day, both on the diplomatic side in the first panel, and of course also on the research side. So with that, let me wish you all a very good debate, to us a very good debate, and with that I would now pass the floor to Gil. Thank you.
Dr. Gil Vorsiano, the CEO of WIM, please unmute yourself.
Okay, now I'm on mute. Okay, terrific. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon to our participants and to our audience. It is a pleasure to share this virtual stage with the Institute of International Relations Prague, and I completely share Andrei's comments about the importance, the emphasis of creating those strategic dialogues to discuss global and regional challenges in the current phase. From an Israeli perspective, we always looked at the presidency, a state-based presidency of the EU, with somewhat of an ambivalent note, because half a year, in our terms, in regional terms, in Europe and in Israel and in the Middle East, is a pretty short term when we speak about a change of policy and issues as such. And especially when we are dealing, as you mentioned, with a major, large-scale global event with historical proportions in Europe and beyond, such as the war in Ukraine. But I think, as you mentioned, we have two things that definitely work for us when we're examining the potential for new initiatives and policy initiatives and even strategic directions. One is the strong and I would say uniquely constructive framework of relations between Israel and the Czech Republic, which I think, and I'm continuing our discussion from beforehand, goes beyond the economic or political relations into strategic narratives, into autobiographical narratives. The stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and our national identity and our national perception, I think it creates a bond more than a strategic relations between the countries, which we definitely take forward when we speak about defining the strategic relations between Israel and the EU altogether. So that's maybe on the first phase. So today we will try, I think, to address three major aspects of those opportunities. First of all, discussing the global level, the influence of the war in Ukraine on the Middle East, on Israel, and on Israel-EU relations altogether. The second one is maybe discussing, I wouldn't say one of the most important regional dynamics of the last 2 decades, referring to the Abraham Accords, the normalization process, trying to also maybe see where the EU and the European role is at regarding this important development that reshapes the region, the alliances, the alliance threat, the priorities, and so on. And then maybe we can also touch upon the particular or the specific framework of Israel-EU relations. And of course, I'm referring to the somewhat of a breakthrough or definitely progress in discussing convening the association, the EU-Israel Association Council for the first time since 2012. So without further ado, we can move to our first panel. And thank you very much for the partnership and to the audience for the participation.
Thank you, Gil. Thank you, Andre. And we are beginning the first panel. Actually, it's the first roundtable. That is we are hosting a range of diplomatic personalities who I'll introduce shortly, and we wish to speak about the diplomatic perspectives of those 3 agendas which I will present. So first of all, let me again welcome all the ones who have joined us to this virtual conference and say good afternoon. And I will present, as I said, the first 3 agendas. So the first one is Russia's war on Ukraine and its indirect implications. We are not going to speak so much about the Russia and Ukraine direct implications, but on the indirect implications of this war that is strongly influencing all the world, be it energy, price hike, the economic and social implications, or be it food security, which can have acute influence in the Middle East and Northern Africa region. It is also felt very strongly, obviously, in NATO, among NATO members, and in terms of security and defense. And it is also very much felt in the EU, in Europe, much more even than in the United States or in Canada, when it comes to its common foreign and security policy, to common security and defense policy, obviously, and even more so in energy, in the inflation, and other social and economic impact that this war brings to Europe. From a political point of view, much of the world has become split between the pro-Ukrainian democratic liberal camp versus the pro-Russian autocracies. However, this split is not so clear-cut, and even in the EU, it is not very speaking in one united voice, and we see Hungary under Orban remains as some sort of an outlier. So this will be the first topic that we will discuss. We will discuss the Russian-Ukraine war implications on Israel-EU relations more specifically. The second issue we'll address is the Abraham and Normalization Accords, which have reshuffled alliances in the Middle East and are creating new axes of cooperation vis-a-vis old conflicts. The Abraham and Normalization Accords were done under the United States and under President Trump without any European Union involvement, and we'll ask what is Europe's place and what can be the role that the EU can or should play in this new game in town. And last but not least, we'll address the approaching Association Council between the European Union and Israel. And this Association Council did not, as Gil was saying, did not convene for the past decade, and it reflects the tensions and bad political relations which took place between Israel and the EU between 2009, 2012 until 2021 under the Netanyahu governments. So I want also to make an initial connection between the Abraham Accords and the improvement of EU-Israel relations. And I want to remind the audience that the Abraham Accords actually came as a sort of an answer to cancel the annexation plans that Netanyahu declared upon, at least the wishing of the government to examine such annexation. The EU played a major role against annexation, and the Foreign Minister of Israel, Gabi Ashkenazi, actually took advantage of this Abraham Accord, this 180 degrees turns in Israel foreign policy from annexation to the Abraham Accords to also improve Israel's relations with the European Union. But the major positive trend in EU-Israel relations that I hope we will see very shortly in the next few weeks came almost 1 year later when Yair Lapid became the foreign minister and alternative prime minister back then, prime minister now, under the Bennett-Lapid government. So there is also a connection between the Abraham Accords and the improvement of EU-Israeli relations. And here I would like to begin with my questions to the panel of diplomats. And I will very shortly introduce you when I will give you the floor to speak. And we have, again, a long list of distinguished diplomats, and we have very short time. So I would like you, if you can, to limit your response for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, each of you, in each one of the 3 round questions that we'll go through. And the first question addresses the Russian-Ukrainian war, and I want to split the question into 2 parts. And the first one is, what are the major implications that the Russian war against Ukraine has brought to EU-Israeli relations? If you can stress 1 or 2 implications, which seems most important to you. So that is the first part of the question. And the second one is that in addition, Israel's stance on the war was careful and cautious. When Naftali Bennett was prime minister, the Israeli government spoke in 2 voices. The prime minister was much more cautious, and he did not mention Russia when denouncing its aggression, while Foreign Minister Lapid expressed much more clear and harsh criticism vis-a-vis Russia and echoed the liberal democratic normative camp position. So I would like to ask the Czech and the EU diplomats in our panel, what were your countries or the European External Action Service, the EU, impressions from Israel's position regarding the war? And I would like to ask the Israeli diplomats, how did you experience the reactions of the EU or the Czech Republic and public opinion reactions to Israel's position towards the war? I would like to open the first roundtable with the ambassador of the Czech Republic to Israel, with Ambassador Martin Stopnitzky, please. And just before I will let you answer, please do unmute yourself. Before I will let you answer, I will say that before becoming the ambassador of the Czech Republic to Israel, you were the foreign minister between the end of 2017 and the middle of 2018, and you were the Minister of Defense of the Czech Republic between 2014 and 2017. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the floor. Let me just say hello to Anna. Hello, Anna, and all the participants, and thank you for organizing this meeting. We are slightly running out of time, I have the impression, so I'll try to be brief. However, the topics, all of them, are rather complex. The first one, Russia's war in Ukraine. Let's talk about Israel, okay? That's maybe the point to make. I think that Israel is vis-a-vis this conflict in a very, very special position. I suppose we all know about the threat represented by Iran to Israel. We all know about special Iranian units operating on Syrian soil. And we all know about Iranian training of Syrian forces and about the supply of military equipment. Israel simply must react, attacking military targets which represent a real threat, as I said. And now, who is the boss in the Syrian airspace? Well, it's Russia. Russia, which is remaining more or less silent when Israel attacks training camps and military warehouses. And Israel has been the target of quite severe critique in the international arena and media, first of all. The reason was that the Israeli condemnation of the Russian aggression was considered to be not hard enough, as you have mentioned. Well, let's admit that Israel has already enough enemies. It cannot afford losing this special regime with Russia in Syria. Despite of that, there are dozens of thousands of Ukrainian refugees coming to Israel. There is a top military Israeli hospital in Ukraine saving many lives. And there are tons of humanitarian aid and material. Well, despite of that, as I have said, Israel is often being criticized and considered as passive or lukewarm in condemning Russia. I don't know, do these critiques know about the context, or is it an example of double standards, of maybe lack of knowledge or information? I don't believe that. Some of these voices should maybe take into account that Israel is rather more than less in a constant war. Criterions born in a fancy café dans le quartier latin are quite inefficient and really difficult to be used in the rough and complicated reality of the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And the second speaker will be Ambassador Anna Azari, the Ambassador of Israel to the Czech Republic. I would also like to mention that she has been the Ambassador of Israel to Ukraine between 1999 and 2003, then Ambassador of Israel also to Moscow, to Russia. She was there also in 1995, but it serves as an ambassador in 2006 onwards. Then she was also the director of the European department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Please, Anna, the floor is yours.
Good day, nice to be in this company. It's very typical of the heavenly country I live in that the Czech ambassador gave all the explanations which we had to give when criticized. Seriously speaking, in the public opinion, I do think that our double position, at least public double position, was accepted critically, but critically in the Czech understanding of the word, which was mildly critical, and our answers were usually that on everything that matters, including all the votes, the Lapid position was the deciding one, and that we are even part of Rammstein process, though very, very quietly. Something which switched the public perception was, believe it or not, Russian help. The moment Lavrov had this anti-Semitic attack of his, and later on, when the Russians started to speak about shutting down the Jewish agency representation in Russia, it kind of, it was used in the Czech Republic. I don't know, my colleague in Brussels will tell how the others picked it up, but it was used in Czech Republic to show that actually Israel's position is better than it was perceived. I think that by now, since Lapid became the prime minister, we are more or less even now. But well, we have elections on November 1 as usual, almost. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Azari. And I would like the next speaker to be Mr. Karel Hallergaard, who is the acting manager director of the Middle East and North Africa in the European External Action Service. Can I also say that Mr. Hallergaard was also the deputy head of the EU delegations to the UN and other international organizations in Geneva. Please, Karel, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Maya. Good afternoon, colleagues and friends. I'm happy to be here and to participate in this event under the aegis of the Czech Presidency. We are very happy. We're very attached to our presidency system, and we greet all Czech friends. We started the presidency by going to Prague, all of us, and had good meetings there. So greetings to all. I can be quite brief on this issue because I think that we have not had major criticism or backlash or dissatisfaction with regard to Israel when it comes to Ukraine. We have had we were very pleased to see that that Israel voted in favor of the resolutions in the General Assembly in the UN. This was sort of the important moment when the cards had to be put on the table, and we were very happy that Israel voted in favor. We understand the complications for Israel, notably with regard to Syria. Ambassador Skobniewski mentioned this, and this is real, and so we understand that, and therefore we were happy, and we have not had difficult discussions or dissatisfaction, I would say. We will have a big discussion, if everything goes well, with the Arab League on this issue in the beginning of October. This might be something different. Let's see what they will say. And Israel is of course also, as a wealthy country, as a country of resources, is able to deal with the consequences of the war, of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, in a better way than some of its neighbors, and we're busy helping them with food security issues and energy, as you know, and we appreciate also the help that Israel can give in this respect in the new regional dynamic that was mentioned before. So for us, this has not been a bone of contention, I would say, between Israel and the EU. But of course, we will have the opportunity to discuss it when Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Lapid comes to Brussels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karel, and we are looking very much forward to Lapid's visit in Brussels. And it's interesting to note the differences between Eastern Europe, who obviously feel or Eastern European Union countries who feel the war much more closer to
I don't call us Eastern Europeans, it's Central Europeans. They are going to be dead if you continue with it.
Apologies, Anna. I'm not a diplomat, so I would ask to strike that Eastern European remark and rephrase as Central European countries. But it's interesting to note that the Central European countries feel the way they feel about Israel is quite different from what the European External Action Service or Brussels feels Israel with regards to Israel. And our next speaker would be Ambassador Chaim Breger, who is the ambassador of Israel to the European Union and to NATO. Chaim was also the chief of staff for Foreign Minister Ashkenazi, and beforehand he was also the deputy chief of staff, if I'm pronouncing the position correctly, for the Middle Eastern issues and the Middle East peace process between 2016 and 21. He has a long and other careers, but he also served in Oman between 96 and 98, and I thought it would be interesting to mention that as well. Chaim, please, the floor is yours. And I also like you to refer, maybe we can do it very quickly later. You didn't so much, I'm not speaking to Chaim, I'm speaking to all the speakers. So we'll open a new small short round of questions. What was the implications of the Russian-Ukraine war on Israel-EU relations? Please, Chaim.
So let me thank you, Maya. I was the head of Middle East Division and chief of staff for the foreign minister, but Regarding the implication, let me start with what Carl said, and I can say that we didn't feel here much the tension over our unique position when the war started. We have open channels to the external service and the EU, and I have today, we have a very fruitful discussion over that. This is not the place where we have some major disagreement. We have other things that we do not necessarily agree, like Iran, like the Palestinian, but this is definitely was one of them. I can say that the implication was at the beginning, I think there was a lot of opening towards the unique Israel position, following the fact that Russia is our neighbor in Syria. And I think it was well perceived, especially after the vote at the UN, where we stand together with the West. Now, following I think the attempt to mediate by Bennett, I think it's a little bit give us some points. And also if there were few elements that criticize Israel, I think they understand that somebody need to speak with Putin. And I think it was as well a move that actually positioned us in a better situation. The turning point for us and for everybody was Bucha. And in this stage, I think Israel took more and more a strong position against the war with Ukraine, and also on that we I think have a discussion, and our position was well received. On top of it, of course, all the assistance that we provide. So the implication was, if I turn into more practical manner, first of all, Europe feel for the first time since many years actually war in the heart of Europe, and for us, I mean, I think the focus was shift towards this, and other things that were important for them or for us was put aside against, like Iran, like the Palestinian, and like other. In some cases, it's worked good for us. In other places, not much. But the overall focus in the last 6 months is there. So there is a very few areas where the EU is open. I'm happy that one of them is the association, and this is the second outcome, the implication. This is the association is not going to happen because of the war, but I think in the EU, some member states understand the importance of Israel as the island of stability in the Middle East, as an area where they can count on us, an area that at the end of the road align with the West. One more concrete implication was the MOU that we signed with Egypt and EU supplying gas that will move from Israel to Egypt, will liquefy and shift to Europe. We got a lot of strong support for that and appreciating it was done during the visit of President von der Leyen. So all in all, I can say that the bottom line, I think that we are the place that we should be. There is not something that, there is not a dramatic change. And the focus is right now less on us and more on what's going on there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Regev. And our next speaker will be Mr. Radomir Karlik from the Department of Middle East and North Africa at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic. Please, Radomir.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you very much for organizing this event. Basically, at the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we perceive two aspects of the current situation of Russian aggression in Ukraine and Israeli involvement in it. First, we highly appreciate Israel's support for Ukraine, their supply of humanitarian aid and medical equipment, which in its amount exceeded 100 tons, as well as the supply of defensive military equipment in the form of safety helmets, vests, gas masks, etc. And one of the most visible elements of this Israeli humanitarian aid to Ukraine was the establishment of the Kochav Meir Field Hospital in the Lviv region, close to the Polish border. The hospital treated more than 6,000 patients in a month of its operation. And there was a very fruitful cooperation established between the field hospital and the burn medicine clinic of the University Hospital Královské Vinohrady here in Prague to provide for the transport of burn patients from Ukraine for treatment in Prague. And the Israeli humanitarian aid goes on even today. At least a dozen Israeli humanitarian NGOs still operate in Ukraine. At the same time, and it was already touched upon by the preceding speakers, it is necessary to understand Israel's position on Ukraine's repeated requests for the supply of weapons. And this must be seen in the context of Israel's security interests in relation to Iran and its activities in Syria. And here it is in Israel's interest to maintain the existing security communication mechanism with Moscow, which is also involved in Syria, and hence the very delicate attitude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Radomir. And our last but not least speaker is Mr. Andrea Pontiroli, who is the deputy head of the European Union delegation to Israel. And Andrea just began his position in Tel Aviv very recently, and beforehand he was the counselor for the Middle East and Northern Africa region at the EU delegation to the United Nations. Please, Andrea, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you, Maya, and very happy to be here with you on what is my 6th day in Israel. So very happy to be here and already enjoying the Tel Aviv. I think that many of previous speakers have mentioned like the appreciation that we have for Israel standing, with us and with Europe on what we say the right side of history. Personally, of course, I was in New York and I was very much involved in the negotiation of the first 3A resolution. So, of course, I leave that vote personally, and I can only reiterate what Carl and other speakers before me have said on that. Maybe like to contribute a bit from our perspective here in Israel. As you all know, there is a very sizable Russian-speaking minority here in Israel, and what we have done here, particularly, we have made some special efforts, my colleagues are here, to demonstrate our solidarity with the Ukrainian people here in Israel. For instance, some of you might know that we invited a Ukrainian folk band to play at our Europe Day reception in May, where we collect a donation for Ukrainian refugees. And next month, for those of you who are here, we are planning to mark International Peace Day on September 21st with a special event, again, to dedicate to increasing support for Ukraine. The event will be at the Tel Aviv port, and will be a photo exhibit highlighting the terrible coastal war for ordinary Ukrainians. And as you all know, we, as European Union, are strongly, not only we strongly condemn Russia aggression, but we also have been strongly supporting Ukraine. And as you know, our financial support and immediate relief efforts today stands at over 9.5 billion euros. I'll end it here, and thanks again for hosting us. And Maya, I give you back the floor.
Thank you very much, Andrea. We do have about half an hour left to our panel, and I do want to move to the Abraham Accords and to the convention, to reconvening the Association Council between the European Union and Israel. But if we could very, very shortly, maybe 30 seconds for each one of the participants, do mention what are the implications, one or two implications of the Russian war against Ukraine on EU-Israel relations. That would be very good for the continuation of our roundtable. So I would go by the same order of participants, and Ambassador Stropinski, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So the Abraham Accords, well, I would say that they are undoubtedly a big political success in the Middle East, and unfortunately not a European one, but American. Let's maybe discuss why, but they represent a very important step in the normalization of the...
Ambassador, may I interrupt? I would like to again repeat my question. Before we move to the Abraham Accords and normalization, I would like to ask you to speak maybe of the implications on the Russia against Ukraine war on EU-Israel relations. So maybe I interrupted you too early.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't understand correctly. Well, let's be practical. We could talk about gas, for example, the Israeli gas going through Cairo to Europe. Luckily, I hope it will work. Not everybody's in favor of it, but it could be a very tangible contribution. Full stop.
Thank you so much. And Ambassador Rosari, please.
At this point, I don't see direct implications, even though I assume that the direction inside Europe is towards realistic approach in foreign policy. Realistic approach to foreign policy should eventually bring some kind of influence, should influence the Israeli-EU relations. At this point, I see the realistic approach growing. I don't see the implications yet. I would leave it at that.
Thank you, Anna. And Mr. Harald, please.
Thank you very much. Just very briefly, I mean, I think that for us, certainly in Europe, the war in Ukraine is an existential issue, an existential threat to us. This is how we perceive it. And in moments when you're faced with existential threats, which has not been the case for us for some time, as Ambassador Regeb said, is right. You of course, you look for support, you look for friends, you look for allies. And I think in that sense, we have somehow, we sharpen our minds, we look around us, and we see in Israel a friend that we can work with, with whom we can rely in some respects. And I think this is maybe if we can speak of an impact in the sense, but specifically, technically speaking, I don't think it has made a big difference. But of course, emotionally and politically, we are in a different place than we were 6 months ago. It's very clear.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Regeb?
Yeah, I mean, shortly, three things. First of all, the shift of focus, as Carl and others say, Europe now is concentrated only on that. It means that other area left aside. Second, understand that Israel is stable, island of stability, where there are some impact of shortage of wheat and other areas like in Egypt, Jordan, Palestine. Israel is not facing any shortage, which means Israel know how to cope with this crisis by itself. And the third thing is turning those things into practical cooperation. We mentioned oil. We're looking into food security and other that maybe in the near future will succeed to push forward.
Thank you very much. Please, Mr. Karlik.
The conflict actually brings up the importance of the strong alliances and relations, and we believe that the EU-Israeli Association Council will be a timely event that could reflect on this development. So we'll see what will happen.
Excellent. Mr. Tiroli, please.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, I subscribe to what Carl has just said. You know, we are facing an existential crisis. We are looking for friends. We're not forgetting the rest of the world. You know, we're very, very conscious of the consequences when it comes to the food prices, you know, around the world. As I mentioned, I was in New York until very recently, and there we were very engaged with the United Nations and our allies there to try and address in the best possible way the consequences for the rest of the world, which are paid, of course, suffered mostly by low-income countries. And I think that, you know, this is something we will continue doing while trying to put an end to the Russian aggression, of course. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a really good summary, I think, of so many implications that we already see on the relations. And I want to move to our second topic, which is the Abraham Normalization Accords. And this, it's not just an event, obviously it's a process that has changed dramatically, or we will see also the dramatic changes in the Middle East of those accords. They are reshuffling alliances in the Middle East and are creating new axes of cooperation towards old conflicts. The EU's initial response was very cautious. It was welcoming, but it was cautiously welcoming those accords, and had reservations and criticism on dropping the Middle East peace process and the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I think Chaim also mentioned it, that some things went aside. And I think that is how the EU approached the Abraham Accords to a great extent. So my question is, what were your countries or EU impressions from Israel's position in that regard? Let me rephrase. What is the importance of, I'm sorry, there is something lacking in my questions here. Okay, so the EU's initial response was very cautious and welcoming. What could be the EU's role and contribution to the Abraham Accords, to the Normalization Accord with agreement with Morocco, and how the EU can perhaps cooperate and be also a partner to this new game in town, and how can and how should it? So this is the question, and Ambassador Regev, I will give you the first opportunity to answer, please. You know, as I presented you at the beginning,
it's honor, since I was deeply involved in the Abraham Accords, and I, as head of Middle East Division, I opened the Israeli embassies in the Arab. So this is no doubt that this was one of my main goals here when I arrived to Brussels. It took me time to understand that I'm in Brussels, not in Abu Dhabi or Manama or Rabat. Finally, I adjust to that. And I have to tell you that it took time, but I think the EU start to understand that, because from their perspective, Abraham Accords was some initiative by Trump and some Arab wars, and they neglected the Palestinian track, and it took time. And I think with the help, quote to quote, of the war in Ukraine, they understand there is something new there, something important, something that they should put more attention and efforts to actually join this effort. And I'm happy to tell you that finally we have, for the first time, a successful initiative that took place 2 weeks ago, where for the first time Moroccan, Israeli, and representatives from the EU sit together and discuss how to work together to improve the water market in water challenges in Morocco. And for the first time, EU actually invite to Brussels, finance this workshop. And for 4 or 5 hours, experts from Morocco, Israel, and EU sit together and discuss this topic. And we see how much the EU, it's led by DG NIR with the support of the external service. I really would like to see more happening. The next stage will be in Morocco, beginning of next year. So there is at least one concrete outcome. Besides that, I can tell you that I have several discussions with the Arab ambassadors here and with some member of parliament, as well as I discussed it with the external service. And I think that there is, as I mentioned, an opening, and we are looking forward to have the second and the third project. But it's not only project, it's also raising the awareness. And I think we're getting close to that. Part of the association, by the way, when we will have it, inshallah, there will be also, we're going to discuss as well as regional cooperation or trilateral cooperation, as we call it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chaim. And please, Mr. Hallergaard, can you also refer to the question?
Yes, thank you very much, Maya. Indeed, I mean, you may feel that we were cautious, but I think we were positive to the normalization agreements. We reacted positively. We did this with all the member states. In each case, we ourselves, we have normal relations with Israel, so we are pleased to see that countries in the region establish the same normal relations with Israel. And we made very clear statements at the time. When we look at our what we call sometimes our southern neighborhood, one of the big problems in this region is the lack of cooperation between the countries, the lack of regional integration, the lack of economic development and prospects and cooperation across borders between countries. Anything that helps this along is good. We support that, and Ambassador referred already to cooperation with Morocco on water. We're happy to support this. We have a number of other ideas, and of course, it's important that Israel is a very economically successful country, that it is attractive for its neighbors and others to cooperate with out of economic self-interest. And I think that this is becoming more and more clear because, of course, the region is facing all sorts of economic challenges, not least because of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. But so we are supportive of this. The only thing we say in addition is that we, of course, expect and we hope that this cooperation will not mean that there will be less focus on the Palestinian issue. We don't see that there is actually a link necessarily between the two, and we hope that that Israel, as well as the many Arab countries who are interested and involved, will continue the efforts to find ways to make progress in the Middle East peace process. This is not an easy issue, and we've been dealing with this for many years, but it is still there. It does not disappear because of the normalization agreements, and it still has to be settled. And I think actually, given the public opinion in many Arab countries, progress on the Palestinian issue will actually facilitate cooperation between Israel and Arab countries, because it will receive more support from the public opinion in these countries. So we should not forget about that, but it's also actually a factor that will promote and facilitate such cooperation further. And we are happy to see the growth in trade and exchanges with the Emirates, with Bahrain, with Morocco, and this is a positive. In the bigger picture, is very positive for the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karel. We'll move to a Czech perspective from Israel. So, Ambassador Stropinski, now the floor is yours to also refer to that. Please.
Thank you again. Well, no doubt, I would characterize these accords as absolutely crucial and not always enough evaluated, maybe. You know, there may be a certain feeling of, and I'm a bit provocative right now, that it was brought by Donald Trump, and Europe was never a real sponsor of Donald Trump, so to speak, and for understandable reasons. So that was a kind of maybe one of the ingredients in the hesitations at the very beginning. And Palestine has not been asked, well, maybe because of the fact that they would say no, as they say usually no, even to papers that they do not read. So it's a kind of problem. And now, in the case of Morocco or Emirates, for instance, it's really a breakthrough, which brings new momentum, especially to the economic cooperation, but not only. The field of security, for example, is also very high on the agenda. So it's an example of a realistic policy, which goes definitely in the right direction. And the obvious question is, who will be the next? Of course, is there any chance of such accord with other Arab states? Well, I think that it will require some patience. Some more time is probably needed. And the key to future accords lies in the hands of Saudi Arabia. That's the decisive regional player. But nevertheless, we are witnessing a certain cautious kind of détente between Israel and the Saudis. So let's be optimistic, soberly. Thank you.
I'll say, as Chaim was saying, inshallah, to that. We wanted to hear a bit more about the Israeli, the way Israel perceived that Abraham Accords in the Czech Republic. So, Ambassador Azari, the floor is yours.
Well, I'm not Kissinger, and I don't want to accuse the EU of not being able to chew gum and walk at the same time, but it's right now, I think that the EU on the global level is dealing with one issue, and it has nothing to do with Abraham Accords. Actually, it's dealing with the issue it should be dealing in, so it's fine. For me, I think the whole issue of Abraham Accords is much more important for us. And I don't think that even though Israel understands what goes on in the world, I'm not sure that sitting in Israel, you understand how the Ukraine crisis, how central is the Ukraine-Russia war. And that's why I think things will be happening, because the EU is a bigger machine and the MENA divisions are working, and they will continue working according to what they are used to. I don't see anything which is really striking, which has to do with the accords, when everybody else is dealing with, if not directly with the Russian aggression only, then with the crazy energetic crisis going on. And I think if we would look for creative ways of connecting the subjects, probably the issues of energy, gas supply, and so on, as small as it would be more relevant than many of the other issues. So something will be happening because the Abraham Accord countries are doing it. I don't see an amazing role of Europe in all of it.
Thank you, Anna. We are going back to the EU position. So, Mr. Pontiroli, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think that, as Kara explained, we have welcomed the normalization agreement. And I think that, just to give you an example, because you asked also what can we do, I think that here in Israel, well, very recently, our Ambassador Dimitar Chanchek, who, by the way, regrets that he cannot attend this conference himself today because he's traveling abroad. He was very, very happy and eager to address a recent session of the Knesset Abraham Accords caucus. And the delegation here in Tel Aviv has actively worked to bring Israel and the Arab world closer together. For instance, by our three-part series of climate diplomacy workshop together with the Perez Center. And of course, we continue looking for additional way to contribute to and support Israel's food integration into the neighborhood. Normalization, as Kar said, is something we can only welcome and support in our closest neighborhood. And at the same time, of course, we really hope that this normalization with Arab states in the region will also advance the process leading to peace with Israel's closest neighbors. I don't have to repeat this, our position on the importance we attach to a comprehensive solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But over to you, Maya. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And our last but not least speaker, again, returning to the Czech Republic's view, to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Karlik, please.
Thank you. The Abraham Accords can be regarded as a game changer in the relations between Israel and the Arab world. And they were not, and this is the most important thing, just one shot on glory, but they have flourished in developing cooperation in many fields so far. And this cooperation goes well beyond the area of economic and security ties. Now, cooperation agreements are being concluded in the fields of aviation, cybersecurity, health, water management, just to name a few. And maybe the agreements might even become an impetus for Egypt and Jordan to warm the so-called cold peace with Israel. Who knows? Regarding the European Union, the Czech Republic welcomes the efforts of the EU Special Representative for the Middle East Peace Process, Mr. Sven Koopmans, who in a way draws inspiration on the Abraham Accords and pushes for the EU initiative that can move forward the relations between Israelis and Palestinians and the Middle East peace process as such. So this is my intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we are moving now to our third and last topic on the agenda. In July, the European Union's Foreign Affairs Council gave a green light to reconvene the EU-Israeli Association Council. Last time the Association Council convened was 2012, so 10 years ago. The Association Council is the official forum for political dialogue, and it can advance the relations between EU and Israel forward. And I wish to ask, what is the importance of convening the EU-Israeli Association Council? This is one question. What is the importance? The second one is to link this question and to ask, what is the importance of convening the Israeli-EU Association Council under the current situation of Russia-Ukraine war and the Abraham Normalization Accords? So some of the issues have already been raised, and if you want to make this triangle of those three topics, tie them together, that would be very much appreciated. And we would go in the order, just a moment, of having, I think, Karl Hallgaard, I would like to give you the first opportunity to answer, please.
Thank you very much, Maya, and I mean, thank you also for your paper. We looked at it carefully, and we know that this is we pay a lot of attention to it, and you're right, because it is a big event, I think, and for us, and certainly also for Israel, and we are happy that we are now able to proceed, and we are in the midst of the preparations here. We have discussions amongst our member states, so that we have a good EU position, EU statement for the meeting. I think the significance of this is that we resume. I mean, it's been 10 years without a meeting. I think we as we've said repeatedly, we focus a lot on Ukraine here in Brussels now for obvious reasons, and we will continue to do so. But I think it's important for us to show that we pay attention to also our southern neighborhood, to our southern neighbors and friends and partners. And the particular case of Israel, I think this meeting will show, because we tend to somehow simplify sometimes, or perceptions are maybe a bit simplified sometimes, that relationship is either very good or very bad, or that we are very divided, or that it's but in fact, if you look at the EU-Israel relationship, you will see that it's one of the broadest and widest relations we have with any of our neighbors. Israel is involved in so many different parts of the EU areas of work. I think we are about to agree on the signature of an agreement to associate Israel to Creative Europe program, and Israel is really part of our EU machinery in many ways that I think many don't know. So the perception that the relationship is bad is actually not really true, and it never really was, because the bilateral cooperation between EU and Israel has always been very broad and very good. And I think it's a good opportunity to illustrate this, because we tend to focus maybe sometimes a lot on specific issues, including the Palestinian issue, other issues, on Iran, where there are differences, but there's a solid piece in the middle where we work very well together, and we're very happy. And there's a lot of support, I think, in Brussels, certainly, and in our member states, to maintain and to develop this cooperation further. It's difficult, actually, to imagine how to develop much further, because it's already very well advanced, and Israel is very, very capable of making absolute best use of its relations with the EU. And I'm sure Ambassador Regev will confirm that he is among the most busiest ambassadors here in Brussels to make sure that all of this runs smoothly. This being said, and I mean, we will of course discuss this, and we will highlight this in the meeting. At the same time, we of course have issues where we have differences. Ambassador Regev mentioned it on the Palestinian issue, on Iran. We see the meeting as a good opportunity to discuss. We are at the key stage of the negotiations on the JCPOA. We have different views. It's important that we explain our positions, and that we understand each other better, and that we find ways of accommodating our views in the way we proceed. These are fundamental security issues for Israel, but also for us. And I think this will be an important discussion. And the same goes for the Palestinian issue. We remain, as European Union, very much engaged. We are the biggest, we as EU as a whole, we are the biggest supporters of the Palestinian Authority, of the Palestinian people, of UNRWA, etc. We are very much engaged, and we want to work with Israel and see what we can do. We don't really agree on everything, but it doesn't mean that we can't find ways of moving forward. Radomir mentioned our special representative that we have who works on this. This is important for us. It's important for our public opinion. It's important for our European Parliament. And this has to be part of the discussion. And that we don't agree doesn't mean we shouldn't discuss it. And we should try to overcome the differences. So for us, this is actually a good opportunity. And we don't need to agree on everything. We are different actors. We have different perceptions and views. But it should not prevent us from talking. And I think certainly from our side, and the High Representative will be keen to raise these issues and discuss, but also to give visibility and awareness about the other part of the relationship, which is maybe less visible on a daily basis, and where we are really very satisfied with Israel, and certainly it stands out compared to all the other countries in the southern neighborhood. The level of relations that we have with Israel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I absolutely agree about the wealth and well, the width of the relations between EU and Israel. And in many of the papers that I write, I actually try to stress to the Israeli public how strategic those relations are to Israel, not only in economic terms, but in many other aspects. So absolutely. I want to stay and remain in Brussels. We are short in time. So I would like to give the floor now to Chaim Reged, Ambassador Reged, please.
Basically, I agree with Carl. It's not because we are planning to be nice to each other before the association. This is really reflect what I feel here. And I have to say that since I came here, maybe 90% of my time is on positive agenda, is promoting things. And there is this 10% that I need to handle with the topics that we discuss. But all in all, I can say that really, I was as well surprised to see the scope of cooperation and how much I got actually a warm welcome since I came here, and I feel it. Now, the day after, the good question, what will happen the day after? I don't think that I will practically wake up in the morning and my life will be dramatically changed. I will keep go, knock on doors, and try to push for cooperation, and things that happen we will make them maybe better, but it's a kind mainly of symbolic step, important symbolic state. And exactly, I fully agree with what Carl said. There is a difference, and I see the difference, the tone of, you know, having the association will not change the position of the EU vis-a-vis the Palestinian, Iran, region, whatever. But there is a huge difference if we use what we call it a megaphone, you know, diplomacy, or we sit and discuss those things. And this is the main change that we are seeing, and we see it, and we will see it in the association. And besides this symbolic event, also there are some practical implications that we are learning, like pushing for partnership priority and other programs that we couldn't join before this and maybe after. So, and definitely last sentence, it will take off my table a huge headache that since I came here, I really invest a lot into it. So this is the most important thing that's going to happen to my life the day after October 6th or whenever we'll have it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chaim, and we wish you no more headaches, not too big headaches in your continuation in Brussels. So I want to move now, Andrea, to you and ask you if you want to add anything to that.
I would want to add, I think I would love to say that it's not important, but I dealt so long to get before Chaim came to Brussels with this. It's back to normalcy, but the main issue of what's going to happen in EU Israel formal relationship is going to be dependent on the result of the Israeli election more than on anything else. That's my addition.
Thank you, Anna. Andrea, now we'll move to you.
Thank you. And three very quick points. First of all, couldn't subscribe more to what has been said both by Ambassador Haim and by Karl, that this Association Council will provide us like a forum to discuss all aspects of our relation, which is very vast. Friends disagree sometimes, but they remain friends. So I think it's totally normal in life as it is in international relations. I just wanted to pick up on one of the points that you said, Maya, very interesting, that, this disagreement, how much the Israeli public values also our relation with the EU, and the fact that sometimes we have this focus on the part of the media, which is more on the points of friction. We according to a recent Gallup poll that we commissioned, that 42% of Israeli Jews have a positive image of the EU, and only 18% have a negative image of the EU, and more than 2/3 of Israeli Jews describe the EU as an important partner of Israel. And the third point, to end with a quote, Prime Minister Lapid said only a few weeks ago that our partnership with Europe is a source of prosperity for Israel and European alike. And we are committed to working together to take the partnership to new heights. So I think that's the best wish that we can all make to ourselves. And thank you again for giving me the floor.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I want to finish our panel with the two Czech representatives. So I would first give the floor to Mr. Karlik, and then Ambassador Stropinski, you could close our panel, please. Karlik, Mr. Karlik.
All right. The Czech Republic has kept advocating for the early convening of the EU-Israel Association Council for a long time. We share the view with other EU member states that the reconvening of the Association Council will be to the benefit of EU-Israel relations and their further development, as well as an asset for discussing wider regional issues, including the Middle East peace process. And there is a wide evidence that the EU-Israel relations have been developing intensively in a number of areas in recent years. And we have had a very strong feeling that the prolonged lack of communication at the ministerial level, as embodied by the Association Council, deprived the EU of an adequate instrument in dialogue with Israel. The current Israeli government, although now just temporary, is open to the EU, as declared many times by the current Prime Minister Yair Lapid. So we regard it as very important and necessary to use this momentum and relaunch the Association Council. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador, please.
Thank you very much for having the honor to finish this panel. Well, the Association Council is a very important event. Absolutely no doubt. And if we as Czechia have contributed to it a little bit, I'm proud of it. It comes after a long 10 years of silence, a special silence, which was often quite loud. Now, frankly, I do not expect a breakthrough in, for example, tackling key problems between Israelis and Palestinians. I don't foresee a rapid game changer in the Middle East peace process and don't expect miracles, really not. But the fact itself of gathering, sitting around one table and discussing together, even controversial issues, has its undeniable value, even a psychological one. It's a proof of goodwill. It's also a symbol. And symbols are so important in politics, as we all know. And I understand the renewal of the dialogue on an official level as something which could bring tangible results. Well, let's do not hurry, but it may come. And undoubtedly, Israel will get its own work in Brussels, I would say. And then we'll keep our fingers crossed. Of course, it requires the capacity of compromise from both sides. We in Europe, we cannot limit ourselves to repeating on and on our dogma not taking into account the developments of, let's say, last 50 years. Of course, the two-state solution seems to be the only way how to resolve the key problem. Okay, but how to achieve it? How? Resolution 242? Going back to the frontiers before the 6 Days War? Do we really mean it? Flexibility, generosity, and rationality will be badly needed from both sides, or rather from all three sides. To repeat a permanent no to all proposals is certainly not a way to achieve some progress, nor is the construction of new settlements, for example. And so it's pretty obvious that it's really not an easy nut to crack. In the context, I think that Europe understood very wisely that Israel, it's a democracy in the Middle East, is a kind of exception to the rule in the region, and that to enlarge the democratic world is a good step, and it's a necessary step. So I understand it this way, and also the political context here in Israel, not to forget to mention the acting Prime Minister, Mr. Lapid, who did a lot, I mean, in the approaching and even pushing Israel closer to Europe. Thank you.
I very much wish to thank all the diplomats who took part in this first panel. It was important for me. We're almost quarter of an hour behind schedule, but it was very important for me to gather your opinions and your contribution to this debate, which was, as the Israelis say, was very dugri, it was very straightforward. So I very much appreciate that, because the second panel, which we'll have after a very short break of 5 minutes to refresh a little bit, would address also those issues that you raised here. And so the first panel will contribute to the second one. So I would like to give us an opportunity to a very short, refreshment. We would take exactly 5 minutes to reconvene and come back here again at 5 and 19 minutes. So we would start the second panel with a researcher then. Thank you so much for all the speakers in the panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for everyone that took place or participated during the first panel. My name is Matthias Hauers. I'm a senior researcher at the Institute of International Relations, and I'm honored to have the opportunity to moderate the second panel, which, unlike the first one, which was more or less composed of diplomats, the second one will be more or less composed of think tankers or members of the academia. And therefore it will offer, I hope at least, a little bit different perspective upon the problematic of EU-Israeli relations. We have 5 distinguished guests here. To start with, we have Ms. Ksenia Svetlova, who is Director of Middle East Relations Program at the Mitvim Institute, and who is also a former Knesset MP, if I'm not mistaken. We have also Dr. Maya Sion-Tzidkiyahu, who moderated the previous panel and is also from the Mitvim Institute, where she directs the Israel-Europe program. And then we have 2 participants from the Czech Republic and 1 guest from the other European country. So to start with, we have Dr. Irena Kalhosova, who is the head of the Herze Center at the Charles University here in Prague. We have also Dr. Peter Lintel, who is leading a project focused on Israel at the Stiftung Wissenschaftspolitik in Berlin. And last but not least, I have here also my colleague from the Institute of International Relations, Azriel Berman, who is a senior researcher with us here in Prague. To start with, I would like to hear what you think about what was said during the previous panel. What is your perspective? What are your reflections as regards EU-Israeli relations and broadly speaking, 3 topics: the war in Ukraine, the upcoming Association Council but also the Abraham Accords and the Middle East peace process. And I would suggest to speak in the same order as I introduced you. So I will first offer the floor to Ms. Svetlova. Please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So it's a bit hard after chairing the first panel to make it very orderly, but I'll try to summarize a few points. First, I think that well, there's no doubt, and you've heard it, that the Israel-EU relations have improved quite significantly in the past year due to the new government under Bennett and now under Lapid. Lapid has introduced a new spirit of positive attitude to the EU in Israel, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in the government as a whole, and also towards the public opinion in the way the government speaks about the EU, much less criticism and much more appreciation. And also, the regional, what's happening in the region, in the world, has contributed to that. So the Abraham Accords, it was one thing. And nowadays, I think we can speak after this past half a year, when the Russia war against Ukraine has been conducted for so long that we could hear in that first panel that the EU now perceives Israel a bit differently. So nothing on the agenda between EU and Israel has changed. The Palestinian issue is very much there. The Iranian issue is very much there. So the disagreements still remain, but Israel can be perceived much more as an asset and as an ally that could be cooperated, the EU can cooperate with. And I think this contributes now to the convention of the Association Council, hopefully in a few weeks. Obviously, the change of the government has allowed that. So Netanyahu not being the prime minister was a good beginning to that. And I think it would be interesting also to do this triangle and also refer to the Abraham Accords. And I think Ambassador Regev has referred to the cooperation that recently Israel began with Morocco. So it was EU funding, but also thinking about what are the EU needs in the southern neighborhood. The EU has a long-term policy towards the southern neighborhood. It has recently published, it was last year in February, it has published a new paper about the new renewed partnership with the southern neighborhood. And I think the Abraham Accords relate to that very, in a good way. And the EU can contribute much more than it has so far to give the Abraham Accords additional meaning so it will be a win-win situation. Win-win in the sense that food security, energy security, water security, the whole Green Deal agenda of the EU has a lot to do with the Middle East, who is the region in the world who is the temperatures are rising the fastest in the world. So it is an aim of the EU to improve how the governments in this region deal with climate change, deal with environmental issues which influence the Mediterranean. And in that respect, the Abraham Accords also contribute to that. And there is, I think, a role for the EU to play when it comes to the Abraham Accords, and therefore the convention or the future convening of the Association Council can also contribute to that respect. I think I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maya. Thank you very much for your contribution. May I please ask now Ksenia Svetlova, Ms. Ksenia Svetlova, to offer her perspective on what was said during the previous panel, and what is your perspective on either war in Ukraine, the role of Israel, but also the EU-Israel Association Council, upcoming council, and the issues that were discussed previously. Please go ahead, the floor is yours.
Well, I always, first of all, thankful for these opportunities that allow us to exchange opinions and to understand furthermore each other and the issues that are of prime significance to each party. Because despite our proximity, despite our closeness, and perhaps even intimacy that developed in the relations between Israel and the EU specifically during the last year or so. Of course, our perspectives are different geopolitically and in many different regards, things that are right now crucial and central for Europe, such as, for example, of course, the war in Ukraine, are seen through different lens in Israel. And that's why I think that, discussions such as this allow to understand even for people who are involved, such as all of the distinguished members of this discussion, of this panel, what are the accents, So I think that there is no argument among us, that everything is important. The two-state solution is important. The Abraham Accords are important. Of course, the very dangerous situation that developed in Europe after the invasion of the Russians to Ukraine. But this is, I think, that the local perspectives that are different from one another. And this is something that perhaps was a little bit missing during this last year. At least, it felt for me this way in Israel, because, of course, like any country in the world, we are no different in this regard. We are self-centered. Our news are self-centered. We like to talk about our problems, about what is happening in a very, very, precise matters about the Israeli politics and so on, and there is always abundance of things that we can concentrate on. And the global and perhaps in the European picture, I think it slipped away a little bit in this regard. And the situation in Ukraine, well, I can tell you, as both the producer of mass media and also consumer of mass media. For example, Ukraine disappeared almost completely from our screens during the last 3-4 months. It was very much there in the beginning, but then it became kind of a European problem or an American problem. And some Israelis, they ask me, so does the war, is it still ongoing? What is happening there? The EU is affected. How exactly are they affected? This is between, Ukraine and between Israel, who is getting the upper hand there. There is not much knowledge. Again, in regards to the EU and its involvement in Israel, well, perhaps, this is something that I would let just float in the air. Perhaps there should be more effort on behalf of the European to explain what exactly is happening. What is the danger to Europe? What is the danger to democracy? What are the global challenges? And not only local challenges, and what is happening in Ukraine. We in between dedicated specifically to this issue a specific panel with our partners in Ukraine, PRISM, and an Institute for Oriental Studies, specifically in order to understand the perspective of one another, not to let things just slip into this, these voids that are not being filled. And the misconceptions, the feeling perhaps of, this something that was mentioned in the previous panel. Well, we feel that Europe is, looking the other way. Because it's of course now very centered on what is happening in Ukraine. First of all, it has all the right to be centered on its own problems once in a while, and not to try to solve anybody else's problems. But I think this is mainly the difference in perspective that prevents from us to really understand what is in stake right now, what should be happening today. In regards to the Abraham Accords and Palestinian issue, well, this is something that regardless of war in Ukraine, that was something that stopped being a key issue on the top agenda of the opinion makers in the EU long time ago. Unfortunately, I'm saying it with great sorrow, because we know when Europe is less involved, bad things happen. Bad thing happens in this regard. I'm, the last person that will advise you how to divide your time, and your focus and the agenda between all of this important issue, but just take it into consideration that this is an ongoing thing. This is not something that developed in the last year or so. And I think that those of us who wish to see Europe more involved, will be very happy to seek common ways of cooperation and looking perhaps for new ways to promote the same old solution of the two-state solution, basically for Israel and Palestine. But the solution is the same. The approach perhaps should be a new one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, too, for your contribution. And now I would like to hand over the floor to Irena Miskalhousova from the Herzog Center at the Charles University. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I will try to divide my answer to two topics. One is a kind of a reaction to what we have heard in the previous panel, and then my little comment on it. It really seemed to be almost too rosy, honestly, when I was listening to the previous speakers, and I don't know. I don't know if it was the way how they were selected or because they are simply diplomats, but they basically use the same words, same examples, and I was a little bit surprised. How to explain it? I think part of the fact that they were diplomats and usually they try to avoid open confrontation, even in this sort of closed circle of friends of Israel and the European Union. I mean, the truth is that Europe is in a very different situation than it was 6 months ago, and we still don't know when the chips fall down, what will happen in Europe. We can see, more unity. We can see more attempt to cooperate, or we can see, rise of populism, even fascism. We can see growing nationalism. We really don't know, and I think this will really will have an impact on relations to Israel. Of course, because, and people spoke already about it, because of the elections in Israel, we will see if actually there is going to be more kind of an ideological synergy between the two or the opposite, right? And so I don't know, it's really difficult to say, but for sure, I think similarly as in the United States, simply the Middle East is now the topic in the EU. So to wait for the European Union to promote, to try to promote the two-state solution scenario, I wouldn't really bet on it. Also because I think, and Europeans talk about it more and more openly, I think many people don't believe that the two-state solution is still an option. It's probably the only option, but unfortunately at the same time, the not too feasible option. So we'll see about that. But definitely, Russian aggression about Ukraine is changing kind of a situation, or has changed the rule of the games in Europe. And I think it's an open question to what extent this is going to help the mutual relations or not. And a little bit to respond to Gil, when he said that we should study Czech position towards Israel, I tend to say that I do that already for the last 10 years at least. So I think there is quite a lot on that, not just from my side, but from other people who deal with the topic. And from my experience, really the position of Israel, especially in the beginning of the war, was very much criticized in this country. And it was especially criticized by those who are staunch allies of Israel. I would say almost instinctive allies of Israel, because they see Israel as a country who is on the right side of history, a country which understands, what war is about, which understand that sometimes you have to use weapons, a country which is willing and able to defend itself. And suddenly we have the war in Europe and Israel is somehow on the fence. We all know that Israel wasn't on the fence, but this is how, it was perceived in this country, at least in the beginning of the war. And I really don't know what kind of long-term effect this is going to have, because as I'm saying, these are important people. These are like these, center conservative people who, I would say, from the core of pro-Israel voices in this country. So I don't know how this is going to play out among the elites. I will follow it and will be happy to tell you more about a year or two. When it comes to people, I really hope we will get some answers soon, because we ran a survey on the position of the Czech population towards Israel before the war, and now we got grants to actually redo the same survey, which we will do in January. So we will have exactly, year gap between those two surveys, and we'll see to what extent, people even reflected on it, or they totally ignore it, what actually happened in the public, in the general public in the Czech Republic. So we'll see. And again, I mean, even though we can, and we don't need to do it here, and Mr. Stropnický did it for us, we know why Israel took the position that it took, but what will be the impact of it on the perception of Israel in Central and Eastern Europe? Again, I think it's still an open question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Irina. Thank you very much, Ms. Karhousewa, for your contribution. And I will follow up on that a little bit later, at least with respect to these possible long-term effects. But first, let me offer the floor to a colleague of us, Peter Winter from the Stiftung Wissenschaftspolitik, and to offer us his perspective on what was said and the topics discussed during these two panels. Please go ahead, Peter.
Thanks all. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm happy to see so many of good colleagues again. But let me follow Irina's point of view a bit and pour some water into the wine. I mean, the EU-Israel relations were portrayed so positively in the previous panel that I was wondering if the notion of the villa and the jungle will also be mentioned, but it was not mentioned at the end of the day. But okay, so a couple of things. As everyone rightly noted, the Russian invasion of Ukraine changed EU-Israel relations to the extent that the EU is busy with different things now. That's entirely clear, and I don't need to repeat that. Having said that, the EU position beforehand was, of course, two-state solution is important, but it was split, it was paralyzed. And that was basically due to, not basically, but it was with the help of Netanyahu's policies, and which was welcomed by some of, not Eastern, Central European states. And so for the EU was basically paralyzed on those issues, with a couple of exceptions when, or not the EU, when E3 or E5 took some initiatives. So the bigger European state made some initiatives on their own, for example, during the annexation crisis. Now, still, I think that the Ukraine or the Russian invasion in Ukraine does have a couple of consequences. One is, which was already mentioned also, is the marginalization of the issue, the further marginalization of the issue. Practically speaking, I think that means, well, at least two things. That the European critique is less vibrant in terms of settlements, in terms of the two-state solution, but also it's an opening for EU-Israel relations, because the EU, some people in the EU at least, tend to become more pragmatic. Let's look at von der Leyen's visits to Israel without mentioning the words occupation, without mentioning the settlements. So that might be one thing. And von der Leyen's visit is also an example for another thing, that I think in the future, a lot of things will depend more individuals, because the conflict is not that much out in the public. It's not as much out in the public, and people will not look so closely what individual politicians, individual head of states, maybe even ministers will do. German foreign ministry, for example, not foreign ministry, German defense ministry has very close ties with Israel, and ever more growing ties with Israel. So, and these are things which are becoming less discussed. So there is on the one hand pragmatism, on the one hand an opening for the individuals to deepen the relations with Israel. On a couple of other notions, I guess I tend to agree. On the overall picture, I think the EU-Israel relations are still not there where they were portrayed in the previous panel. For the reasons I mentioned, for the marginalization, different effects, I think this is overshadowing right now that there's still a rather broad consensus, with the exception of some states, that the EU is quite critical towards Israel policies, especially individual member states, even though it improved now during the Bennett regime. But as other people have mentioned beforehand, well, let's see what the next government in Israel will be. You know, worst case scenario for the EU would be having a Ben-Gvir in the government. I mean, then I don't see any options on the table for improving. It will definitely worsen. I would have to say something to the other points as well, but as, if I understand correctly, we will have time in the future, right? So I stop here.
Thank you very much, Peter, for your contribution, and I will follow up with a question on the next Israeli government in a while. But before that, let me offer the floor to my colleague Azriel, who will offer, I have also his perspective on whether the diplomats' depiction of EU-Israeli relations were too rosy, too optimistic, or not? What do you think?
So I'm inclined to agree both with Irena and Peter that I think the previous panel, there were some rosy, very descriptions, and it was actually Anna Azari, Israel's ambassador to Prague, who said towards the end that what happens with Israel and the EU will depend on what happens in the forthcoming Israeli elections. And I think you said we'll be discussing that as the next question, but it's impossible to ignore, and there's no doubt that if Netanyahu becomes prime minister, which is looking increasingly likely, there will be very adverse implications for Israel's relations with the EU. I will just go into that in more detail during the next question, which you'll be raising. But I will say that this would also this is also relevant to the issue of Ukraine, because Netanyahu has refused to condemn Putin. He has, in fact, he criticized Yair Lapid, the acting prime minister, saying, "Why is he going on about Russia? What Russia is doing? We should be focusing on Iran." And it is, there is no doubt that this is going to cause problems in Israel's relations with the EU, and also with Israel's closest allies in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, it's also worth mentioning, Netanyahu, of course, has had developed very close relations with Israel's, with the Central and European countries. But there's no doubt that if Netanyahu maintains his close relationship with Putin, this is going to cause huge problems, and I'm happy to talk about that in further detail later. Furthermore, I will mention Ambassador Stropnitsky, who mentioned Yair Lapid's role in bringing Israel closer to Europe, and Lapid and Bennett, Naftali Bennett, who was prime minister before Lapid, both deserve credit for their role in improving relations with Europe, and they both saw this was something that Israel needs to do something about. And Lapid said that we don't need, even if there are things we don't like, even if occasionally Europe says things we don't like, we don't always have to overreact. And he's been very pragmatic about it. Also, he has also to give him credit on the fact that he turned his back on the regrettable policy which Netanyahu pursued, which was to develop relations, to strengthen relations with the illiberal governments in Europe, such as Hungary's Viktor Orban. Lapid realized this was damaging. And of course, this also damages Israel's democratic reputation as a democracy. To sum up, I think that certainly the Association Council, which will be taking the dialogue, which will be resuming in October, is a positive development. Certainly the Abraham Accords has had in my opinion, has had an influence on this, because if the Arab countries such as Morocco, UAE, and Bahrain were ready to normalize relations with Israel, in spite of the fact that there was no progress on the Palestinians. So the EU saw, well, if the Arab countries are doing this, then why would we? Then maybe it's in our interest also to start anew with Israel, because the linkage policy of linking dialogue to progress with the Palestinians, it hasn't really advanced things at all. It has been damaging for Europe. It has also been damaging for Israel. So there's little doubt in my mind that the European Union sees it as more profitable to restart dialogue with Israel, irrespective of what's happening with the Palestinians. And this doesn't stop Europe from expressing its strong opposition to certain policies that Israel has been carrying out. Not just settlement expansion, also eviction of Palestinians in East Jerusalem. And also there's been Israel's the closing of certain human rights organizations, Palestinian human rights organizations, which certain EU countries have maintained ties with. So Europe will definitely bring these issues, will certainly be raised, I think. But Europe can raise these issues while still maintaining a dialogue with Israel.
Thank you very much, Azriel, for your contribution. And many of you, well, all of you mentioned Abraham Accords and what might be the possible future of it. But I wonder, especially with respect to what Ms. Svetlova said, and with respect to war in Ukraine that had disappeared in the previous 3 or 4 months, and it might affect the perception of population. I wonder, what is the perception of population of the accords themselves, not only within Israel, but also, I mean, within the wider region, in the Gulf countries, if you can develop that a bit.
There are polls that indicate that in the Arab world, including the Gulf countries, the support for Abraham Accords is falling dramatically during the last 2 years. And these are the polls that were conducted by the Washington Institute for Near East Studies. We see that specifically in countries that are part of Abraham agreements, that were very enthusiastic about the accords, we see the decline in support. And of course, in other countries, the veteran peace partners of Israel, such as Jordan and Egypt, but of course, also in other countries that didn't join so far, like Kuwait, we see decline in every country. Okay, so this is in regards to the Middle East. I think that just like in the situation with Camp David Accords, this is something that I explore actually in my PhD. There was this expectation, at least among the elites, that due to Camp David Accords back then, there will be some progress, and it was also, of course, part of the Camp David Accords themselves. There will be some progress on the Palestinian track. And 2 or 3 years after it didn't happen, then we saw that, again, there are very sporadic and very few polls of that time, But yes, there are specific researches on the attitude among the elite. And we saw a dramatic decline of support of Camp David. So this is what we see right now, because it seems that although many in Israel were too eager to jump on the opportunity to detach the Abraham Accords and the normalization with the Arab countries from the Palestinian track, in the eyes of many people in the Middle East, including decision makers, but certainly among the populations, these issues are not detached, so since the perception is that the Abraham Accords didn't do anything to help the Palestinians, and this is what the Palestinians themselves are saying, then of course I think it's just something that we should be expecting a long time ago. Now in Israel, the accords were extremely popular in the beginning. And I did not see recent polls, and we will be producing them, in between, in our annual report about what people think about different countries in the region. Generally, 2 years ago, 85% of the Israelis supported the accords over the annexation of Jordan Valley. That was then on the table. Since then, again, for those who follow and know what is the volume of cooperation, what are the fantastic opportunities that are opening up in front of the Israeli companies, researchers, and so on. For them, I think that they really appreciate, what is happening. For the average Israeli, it's the opportunity to go to Abu Dhabi or to Morocco on a direct flight, to fly a few less hours to the Far East due to the agreement with Saudi Arabia. And since the Palestinian issue was never a part of it from the beginning, then there is no reason to basically doubt it now and to try to connect it now. So, it's perceived in a very different way in the Arab states and here in Israel. And there is another issue, something that we all should take into consideration. The peace was brought, the Abraham Accords peace was brought by a very specific part of the political map. Yes, it was Trump, and yes, it was Bibi. Despite, the change in government, and many Israeli ministers of Lapid government visited Bahrain and Morocco and the Emirates and so on, but still the chains and the connections that were created prior to Abraham Accords and during the Abraham Accords, they're still standing. And in the civil society, the organizations, most of the organizations that are pushing forward for these agreements and are involved, with the other part, with the Emiratis and the Bahrainis and the Moroccans, we are talking about right-wing, softer right-wing, or even extreme right-wing organizations. Some of them are supporters of, Jews' right to pray on Temple Mount and the recreation of the temple and so on, to this degree. So a very specific part of the political map in Israel right now is engaging with Abraham Accord countries. For the majority of the Israelis, it's a nice bonus. It's something to reconfirm the idea that was pushed and advanced by the Israeli right, that the Palestinians do not matter, that nobody cares about them, that nobody wants to hear of the problems, and of course, every time there is some statement or expression by some leader or some even not a leader, just, a blogger in UAE or Bahrain or whatever, that the Palestinians are not grateful enough to the Emiratis or the Saudis. They are not fulfilling their part in the agreement and so on. This is being highlighted very much by the Israeli media and it's seen by many as the face of the reality. Although we know that by exploring these issues that the reality is very much different. Now the big question is, and I'll stop here, is how do we combine between these two tracks? Because it seems now that almost nobody, not the Palestinians themselves, not the partners of the Arab peace, the Abraham Accords, not Israel officially at least, are interested to put these ends together and try to actually, combine between the positive dynamics of the Abraham Accords with what seems to be as a sure disaster in the West Bank that is just being reconfirmed yesterday by what was said by the Shabak. There's a huge surge in the terrorist activity in the West Bank during this month and the last few months. And the future doesn't hold anything positive. So maybe we missed already this chance. We don't know it yet. But in any case, this is not something that is being widely discussed as of, of today.
Thank you very much. And since we have the last 2 minutes, I will maybe ask 2 forecasting domestic politics related questions. And if you can limit yourself to a few sentences, I very much appreciate that. So first, follow up to what Irena Miskalhausova said as regards the unexpected criticism from the supporters of the Israel, usual supporters, as regards Israeli stance vis-a-vis Russian-Ukrainian war. What do you think? What might be long-term scenarios or the effects of that? You mentioned that you don't know, but just try to speculate. And the other question, what might be the effects of the next Israeli elections? Peter, Azriel. First, Irena, what do you think?
Well, I think we heard it in the first panel. There is now much more realism or realistic approach got strengths in the EU, meaning that, okay, there are more important issues from our perspective now than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we can actually learn something from Israel, and we can buy military equipment from Israel, etc., etc. So let's cooperate with Israel. And I definitely see this path as one of the possible options, which is something which the Czech Republic overall was or has been promoting on the EU level for many years. So I can see this kind of a continuation from the Czech side. I can also see, kind of a little bit more skeptical approach and not seeing Israel as being always, the best allies. And it's not so much, I should say, it's not about Israel as such. It's just that these people, that's what I learned, really look at Israel as almost Israel being a Central European country, not realizing that Israel is in the Middle East and Israel is simply a different geopolitical perspective. So this was quite interesting discovery for me, when talking to these people, realizing how little they know about Israel, even though they support Israel so much. So there can be a little bit of kind of a more skepticism, but we will need to wait and see. And then a lot depends also what kind of European Union we are going to have, and it depends, of course, on the results of elections in next 2 years or 3 years in Europe. And I think with these looming crises in the air, we can see many surprises. And if we have more if we will have rise of more nationalistic or even worse parties in Europe, and I think this is an option. This is really an option. We may see much closer cooperation between future Netanyahu government, Chas v'Chalila, and European governments. So I think there are so many unknowns that we really can hardly provide kind of an answer to this question. But so sorry about not being more specific, but really I think it's going to be very interesting. Not so much because the reality between or in Israel would change, or that there will be too many new topics in Israeli-EU bilateral relations, but because of the situation in Europe.
Thank you very much. And now Peter and possibly Azriel, in a very few sentences. What do you think? What are the possible scenarios of the next Israeli elections and maybe the impact upon the Israeli foreign policy?
let's say, 3 brief sentences to 3 topics. First, let me agree with Irina, how unclear the future is. Just look at Italy. If we have right-wing, even more than right-wing government, that might be very close to a future Israel. Secondly, let me at least say one sentence regarding the Abraham Accords, why it's so complicated for Europe, at least within the framework of the Abraham Accords, because in the Abraham Accords, there is an allusion recalling the Trump vision for peace regarding the Palestinian issue. I mean, this is nothing the Europeans can support, while the overall Abraham Accords are seen positively. And now last 2 sentences maybe to the upcoming elections in Israel. Well, it's very unclear who will be Israel's next prime minister, but there is a chance. There was a looming chance for the last 4 years that we see a very, very right-wing government. I assume that Netanyahu, if he can, will avoid having Ben-Gvir in his government. And if so, I guess there will be somewhat okay working relations with Ben-Gvir, or with the, with the radical right, religious right. It will be very difficult to have. I mean, there will be working relations, but this will certainly be a symbol of a very changed Israel. Last sentence on that, of course, overall, the looming thing overall, of course, the American presidential elections in the upcoming years. If Trump is reelected, or another Democrat or another Republican, things will change all again, or go back, or go even worse in the relations than what we have seen a couple of years ago. That's it.
Thank you. Azriel, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, I would. One issue which hasn't been mentioned is the issue of Iran and the nuclear deal. Here is maybe one area where there doesn't seem to be a huge difference between Lapid and Netanyahu. Lapid is now taking a very strong line against Iran, any attempts to sign this a nuclear deal, which is developing. Obviously some of this is electioneering, but certainly, of course, Netanyahu, if he wins, the Iran issue is a big part of his whole, the fact that Israel is under threat, and that Israel will, this is for him a major part of his political campaigning, is that Israel stands alone against Iran. I think on this issue, certainly Netanyahu will make more noise, but certainly Lapid also has not shown really any strong difference with Netanyahu in this policy. But in other areas, certainly Peter mentioned Ben-Gvir, and we had a statement recently by former Likud statesman Dan Meridor, who said that Israel will become a very different place if Ben-Gvir becomes part of the government. That just shows you how serious it is if extreme right, a figurehead like Ben-Gvir, who was part of really a devotee of the Meir Kahane, who was even during the 1980s, the Likud party would boycotted him because he was so extreme. So Ben-Gvir, who supports terrorist attacks on Arabs, certainly in the past has done so. The fact that Netanyahu has supported someone and sort of tried to bring him into the mainstream shows you about the dangerous sort of direction that he's going in.
Thank you very much, Azriel. I have to interrupt you because we are a little bit over time already, and after opening the panel with Maya, I'll let you a little bit of a breathing space after moderating the previous panel. So if you have a few words to add to what was said during this panel at the very end, please go ahead.
Yes, I do have a few words. So I actually want to also relate to what my colleagues have said here in the panel. And I agree that the first panel was very optimistic and sort of depicted a rosy picture on EU-Israeli relations. And I believe that the current political discussions being held in Brussels over the common position that the EU will adopt when the Association Council will be held, is dealt in a much more positive way because of the last year and a half under the Bennett-Lapid government. So the last year and the panel that we've heard that express such optimism and the importance of the relations is actually to some extent a reflection of the total opposite relations in the decade beforehand. So, you know, I wouldn't say the relations between Israel and the EU are very rosy, but everything is comparative to some extent. And I have written an article about what I call the lost decade of Israel-EU relations between 2009 until 2019, 2020. So there was a lost decade. The Israeli-EU relations have deteriorated to a really significant extent that we haven't seen for many years, if at all, maybe from the Venice Declaration. And the last 2 years have been much more positive, and that also has to do with the Abraham Accords, and that much more has to do with Lapid being the foreign minister. And in that respect, I want to address also the issue of, you know, the perceptions among Israeli leaders, the three candidates to becoming prime ministers, and I would also even include Gantz as sort of, you know, someone who represents other leaders of other political parties, such as maybe Saar, maybe even, you know, other politicians in Israel. So we have Netanyahu on the one hand. I'm not so sure that Netanyahu will be able to form a government. Right now, the polls are very much stuck, and we don't see a right-wing government that Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, and the ultra-Orthodox can have. And we don't see an alternative government like the one that we're having now under Lapid. So Israel is stuck, which means that maybe Lapid would continue to be the prime minister because there will be no new government. So we'll have to see, obviously, what happens after the 7th of November. But in that respect, Lapid presents a really strong belief in the liberal world order, in the new, the post-World War new liberal order, and in the democratic importance of that world order. And this is very different from other Israeli leaders. And we've heard what Netanyahu is thinking about that in his relations with Putin and in other senses. So Lapid is very much different from other leaders. If he would remain in the position of prime minister, that would allow Israeli-EU relations to go forward. Any other leader, well, so let's say Netanyahu, obviously would not, will be much less optimistic. So that is one thing. And the other thing that I wanted to mention was more a European idea that Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, actually floated on May this year about forming, which is related to the Russia war against Ukraine. And Emmanuel Macron was saying, due to this war now, Europe, the EU, has to form the European political community with the UK, with other countries in Europe, vis-a-vis Russia. So it's much more democracies, liberal democracies against Russia and maybe some other countries that support Russia. And I was asking in an article that I was publishing, this community is obviously very much European based, and Israel is not in Europe geographically. In some perspectives, as Irena was saying, some Europeans think about Israel as a European country. Some Israelis, actually a quarter of Israelis, do see Israel as a European country, even though it's located in the Middle East. And I was asking, where is Israel warm if this European political community will be formed? And just a few days ago in Prague, we heard Chancellor Scholz actually supporting this idea, and it's being still discussed. So what can be or should be Israel's position towards the European political community of democratic liberal countries? And Israel, at least within, you know, the 1967 borders, is a democratic and liberal state, and it's a like-minded still with the EU. So I think that question should be asked by the Israeli leaders, and it will be interesting to see what they answer. Obviously, if Netanyahu or even Gantz would be the next prime ministers, or, you know, we just had Bennett and he had only 6 mandates. So almost anyone can be, in potential, the next prime minister if he or she are able to form a government. So the interest of Israel comes first, and almost none of those Israeli leaders are strong believers in the liberal democratic world order as Lapid has been. So that's a question still that I would like to pose.
Thank you, Maya.
Yeah.
Would you like to continue? Or?
No, well, just to say one more thing about what Ksenia was saying about the support in the Abraham Accords towards them, and to mention with regards to the two-state solution, Irena was also mentioning, we don't see the solution happening, but it's the only solution. And when you do this poll in Israel, you have more than 50% of Israelis still support the two-state solution. So even though the Abraham Accords are the only game in town, the two-state solution, I think, is the most likely solution in some form or another between Israel and the Palestinians.
Thank you very much, Maya. And with that, I would like to conclude this panel, which were not so optimistic as the previous one. But anyway, thank you very much for all the participants, for the audience as well. We had two colleagues from Israel, from Mitvim Institute, Ms. Sion Tzidkiahu and Ms. Svetlova. We had two colleagues from the Czech Republic, Ms. Kolhosova and Mr. Berman, and we had one colleague from Germany as well, Mr. Peter Lind here, joining us today during the second panel. Again, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening. Thank you so much for your contribution.